Hey, look at that. Number one question belongs to Dave Olson yet again. So yesterday there was an engine failure on a jet airliner again, setting aside the iron spine of the pilot who outcooled Sully in her transmissions with ATC and sticking the landing. These kinds of engine failures seem to be happening a lot lately. I'm not sure if it's a newer, greener manufacturing or if concern with social justice is taking away time from quality control at GE, Pratt, and Rolls. What say you? I did not know it was a woman pilot on that flight. I just saw the story earlier, and good for her. I've often said things that basically I think make sense in terms of people's general inclinations. I think you find more men want to be pilots than women, and the idea of having an equal number of women pilots is not good for aviation because it means it means people who aren't as good aren't getting the jobs. But what I don't get to say as much as I would like is that to say that just because more men go into aviation doesn't mean there aren't excellent women pilots, including excellent women combat pilots, and I'm very happy, actually exceedingly happy, that Southwest flight was piloted by a woman, and I'm sure she did the same absolutely perfect professional job just like any of the other professionals. So first of all, congratulations to her, and well done. Secondly, I'm not aware of an increase in these kind of things. I don't see it. I haven't been looking for it, but I certainly haven't gotten the sense, Dave, that all of a sudden engines are exploding all over the place. The number of flight hours is increased enormously, and the more airplanes you fly, the more often this kind of thing is going to happen just by simple statistics. But I'm not aware of it. It doesn't seem to be an epidemic or anything of that nature that I can see. The thing I think that needs to be said is that the jet engine, with the possible exception of the electric motor, is the most reliable piece of heavy machinery that I think's ever been invented, by a large margin. I know I've mentioned this a few times before, but just think about it. In the end of the piston-driven, propeller-driven airliners like the Stratocruiser, which my mom was a flight attendant on, or the Constellation, or any of these of the last of the big four-engine post-war prop-driven airliners, every one of those four engines probably had over 1,000 moving parts. You had 18-cylinder Wright Cyclone engines with pistons and rods and pins and valves and superchargers and unbelievable complexity. Plus, what you're asking it to do is you're asking an explosion to occur, not a burn, an explosion to occur to blast this steel cylinder some couple of inches in one direction, at which point it comes to a screeching halt and is immediately rammed back up again and faces another explosion. And this is happening in 18 different places in one engine. And so that is not the kind of device that is going to last forever. That's why they had four-engine airliners. You had four engines because your chance of an engine failure was excellent. And your chance of a two-engine failure was actually pretty good. My mom was flying a Stratocruiser over the North Atlantic Ocean on Christmas Eve, and they lost three engines. And they can't hold altitude on one. And they were able to restart at 800 feet or something. Otherwise, it'd be somebody else doing the worst produced show on the internet. But the jet engine is an astonishing thing. And invented by a fellow named Frank Whittle, by the way. For those of you not familiar with it, I'm not going to go do a whole dissection of the jet engine, but one of the reasons that the jet engine is so effective in terms of power, it's very fuel thirsty compared to internal combustion engine. But an internal combustion engine, let's just say a Volkswagen Beetle, something simple like that, that's what kind of engines we have in general aviation, is just very simple. You open up a valve, air comes in, you squirt some gas in there, close the valve, light it, it explodes, it pushes this metal piston, some distance, and then bang, it comes again. But the power that's being generated by that explosion is limited not by the amount of gasoline you can put in there, but by the amount of oxygen that you can get into that cylinder. Only so much oxygen into that cylinder. So you can put all the fuel you want in there, but you're not going to increase the power because oxygen is the limitation. And as you get higher and higher in the sky, the air becomes less and less dense, so that in the time you can fill that cylinder, the air pressure around it is so low that you have even significantly less oxygen. Eventually a piston engine just won't climb anymore because the air is too thin for it to sustain itself. So some bright people got together and invented superchargers and turbochargers. Turbocharger uses a turbine at the back of the exhaust of a internal combustion engine to drive a compressor. That's a turbocharger. A supercharger just uses a regular motor, but both of them are doing the same thing. They're compressing the air somewhat, so that when that compressed air gets into that cylinder, there's more oxygen available for the fuel, and you get a more energetic explosion and more power out of the engine. But the reason that jet engines are so effective is because the jet engine is essentially just a compressor. That's all it is, a flying compressor. The big blades you see on the outside are not really part of the compression mechanics of the jet engine. When you look at a modern high bypass jet engine, what you're looking at essentially is a turboprop with 30 blades. You're looking at a fan. It's a turbofan engine. The fan is what's moving most of the air. But inside the engine are a series of vanes that look a lot like the big ones you see on the outside. And these vanes turn, and as they turn, they run into counter vanes and so on, and it's extremely, extremely cleverly set up and very precise. But basically, the reason a jet engine is so effective is by the time they put the fuel in there and light it, the air is very compressed. And because the air is so compressed, it's got so much available oxygen that the burn per drop of fuel is much, much more energetic. So that's the big advantage of a jet engine, is the extra power. But the single great advantage of the jet engine is, instead of having every engine having 18 cylinders banging back and forth and all the valves and the rods, they're all operating thousands of times a minute and all the rest of it, instead of this jet flying contraption, you've got one moving part. Basically, it's got one moving part. You've got a series of rotors that are welded in place, and in the middle is a shaft that has compressor blades on one end and propulsion blades on the other. And they compress the air in the front, put it in a chamber, light it on fire. This blast of hot air goes out the back, provides some thrust, not much these days, it used to be all the thrust. And on the way out, it turns a compressor that keeps the fan going. And it's extremely reliable, which is why we went from 4 engines in the propeller-driven era. And when we started with jets, we decided, well, they're still pretty basically new, so let's build 4-engine jets. So the 707, the airplane that really changed the world, Boeing 707, we don't go any faster today than we did when I first took my first flight in 1962. We travel at the same speeds, about 550 miles an hour, round numbers. The 707 was as fast as a modern 737 or 747 within 10, 20 miles an hour. So the 707 had 4 engines. And after we flew with 4 engines for quite a while, we decided that we could probably get by with 3 engines. And so you saw the 727, which has 2 engines on the back and then 1 on the tail, and the DC-10, and became the DC-11, the L-1011, all 3-engine aircraft. And by the time these things are designed and on the market, we've already got enough data and enough confidence in the high bypass turbofan engine to realize that these monsters produce so much thrust and are so reliable that the chance of you having 2 engine failures independently is so close to 0 that it might as well be 0. It's essentially 0. And the trick of all this, as we found out from the Southwest flight, is this only works under one condition, and it's a very simple condition. This is the same condition you get when you have a twin-engine general aviation airplane. There's no reason to have a second engine on that airplane. It just gives you double the chance of an engine failure. There's no reason to have a second engine on that airplane unless you can fly the whole thing on one engine. And that's why we can get away with 2. I do remember that the DC-3, a twin-engine, propeller-driven, regular internal combustion engine, classic airplane, the DC-3, became the C-47. The DC-3 had only two engines, but the DC-3 was so clean aerodynamically, had such a big wing, that it was the first airplane that pilots realized they could train, as they were training, they'd fail one of the engines and they'd be pretty good. So I don't know. I just saw a picture. I didn't know anything about the story. I don't know where the explosion happened. I don't know what part of the flight it happened in and so on. I just don't know. Somebody tell me in a second. But just for your own peace of mind, folks, for those of you maybe not as relaxed about flying as I am or some other people, it's something you need to know, and it's good to know. You are not going to ever fly in an airplane. They will not certify as for passengers any airplane that is not capable of doing the following: fully loaded, at maximum weight, in conditions of thin air and hot air. Any airplane you are going to get into is going to be able to either abort a takeoff, which is a very short period of time to abort a takeoff. You hear that guy put the engines in, or the girl, put the power in, and you start going. You've probably got about 7, 8, 10 seconds in, and after that, you are going flying one way or another. But my point is, if the engine fails very early, they'll abort the takeoff. But if the engine were to fail at the worst possible time, right when you needed the most power to get this airplane off of this runway, the second engine produces enough power to be able to get you into the air safely. You're not going to get anything like the performance you would get with two engines, obviously, but that second engine generates enough power so that you will get in the air and come back and land. You may have to fly around and dump some fuel first, because landings are usually harder on the landing gear than takeoffs are, but you'll keep flying. And that's exactly what happened. It's a fluke. And unless I see a bunch more of them, and you may be seeing something I haven't been seeing, Dave, but they're the most remarkable things in the world. They're just absolutely miraculous, astonishingly powerful and reliable and simple. And if we'd invented the jet engine before the internal combustion engine, and somebody came to somebody with an internal combustion engine, I imagine they'd laugh you right out of the room until you showed them how little fuel it used compared to the jet engine. Then somebody would have your attention, I guess. But yeah, so I'm not aware of any extra failures. If you are one of those people that really, really worries about all the details, there is one thing you can do. Nobody really knows. Look, we haven't had a plane crash in almost 20 years, and not since 2001, so 17 years. But if a plane's going down, it's pretty much the luck of the draw where you're sitting. Usually, probably better to sit in the back, but it's nobody knows. However, if you're one of those people that want to reduce risks as much as possible, you can reduce or eliminate a virtually non-existent risk by not sitting in the plane of the engine's fan. In other words, you got the engine under the wing and the fan is on a plane. You're going forward and the engine spins at an axis that's perpendicular to the motion of travel. So that turbofan is in there spinning very, very high speeds. If something does go wrong with the engine and that thing disintegrates, then the fan blades are going to go all along that arc. They're going to be thrown off along that arc, and some of them will be thrown through the fuselage of the airplane. And I understand somebody was injured pretty severely on that flight, and I'm quite sure that could have only been because when that engine disintegrated, some of the pieces, small number, but some of the pieces departed the engine at high speed and flew into the airframe. So while the chance of an engine failure, most engine failures aren't explosive like that at all. So most engine failures, first of all, they never happen. When they do, they're pretty benign. The engine just shuts down. But theoretically speaking, if you really worry about these things, you can avoid that particular risk by not sitting in the row or 2 rows that are level with not the front of the engine intake, but where the blade is actually spinning. That's not something I lose any sleep over.